Hi.
Hey.
So, I'm just getting my thing open, speech. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you about taking ideology seriously. I'm going to talk to you about this because I obviously think it has something to do with the relative successes of austerity in the last few years. Quite how much it has to do with it is a matter of contestation, but I'll start by telling you 3 short stories about ideology, if you'll bear with me. First one, I was in Barking in Dagenham during the 2010 general election campaign. I should explain, most of you aren't from the UK. Barking in Dagenham is an extremely depressing environment, kind of secluded from the rest of the urban areas that it's surrounded by. It's depressed because it's lost a lot of its car manufacturing jobs and so on. And there was a significant anti-fascist mobilization in the area because of the fascist mobilization on the part of the BNP, who sought to take the local parliamentary seat from the right-wing Labour MP Margaret Hodge. And I was out leafleting with a bunch of anti-fascists. We moved around in large groups to avoid getting beaten up by the BNP or some of their supporters. And it was a rather tense situation. There was a degree of suspicion from some of the residents. The BNP had spread rumours linking a housing crisis to the influx of black people in the area, claiming that this was a result of an Africans for Essex campaign which supposedly gave incentives to black people to move in and thus consolidate Labour's electoral base. I mean, I need hardly say this was bullshit. But we were at one stage heckled by a man yelling at us, "Are you from around here? Are you local?" As if. At any rate, he began to argue with us to the effect that Africans had a huge advantage in gaining access to local services. And stupidly, perhaps, I asked him how he knew this. He looked at me as if I'd just turned into a brightly coloured flamingo and offered him a beat job. And he said, "I've seen it!" Now, I'll come back to this. I just want you to meditate on the meaning of this phrase, "I've seen it." But I'll come back to it in a second. Second story. During a very important strike at a petrochemicals plant in a place called Grangemouth, Scotland, striking and non-striking workers at the plant were interviewed by the media. The workers had been shut out of the plant. Production had been stopped during what workers initially thought was a dispute over the position of their union rep. The union rep had been falsely inculpated in a Labour Party ballot rigging scandal, which was really an anti-union witch hunt organised by the leadership. And this gave the employer, in this case, the opportunity to sack the rep on the pretext of some related corruption and provoke a strike. Once the strike was underway, he sprang on what the real dispute was about. It was about the workers' pensions. The billionaire boss of the company was out to cut the pensions. He'd been out to do it for years and he saw an opportunity here. So once that was clear, the testimonials from people who spoke to the workers, the media interviews made it perfectly clear that there was not a great deal of enthusiasm for the strike. The workers were not prepared for what had been sprung on them. Their answers were at best finger-crossing for a solution. And worse was the arguments from a number of workers, particularly the non-striking workers from other parts of the firm. One of whom, when interviewed, said that he didn't have much sympathy for the strike on the grounds that, frankly, these workers, by striking, were inconveniencing other workers in order to protect their pensions while everyone else had to tighten their belts in these tough times. Again, I'll return to this. Third story. In 2013, the British journalist John Harris was conducting research for a piece on welfare that he was writing, and it was organised around the fact that according to a long-term poll run by Ipsos Mori called Generations, which is a long-term study of opinion on a series of key issues, support for the welfare state had collapsed among the young. And this could be linked to the degree of success which the Conservatives had enjoyed at that point in winning support for various planks of their austerity agenda, particularly those pertaining to the reduction of benefits for the unemployed, for disabled people, and for those on housing benefits. In the course of the research, he interviewed a number of young people who said more or less similar things. Anyone who's unemployed has no excuse, they need to get out there and try harder. But it was the answer that he got from a young man who was actually unemployed himself that left him stunned. He asked him on a hunch whether he blamed himself for being out of work. And the young man said, yeah, I do. He said if only he tried harder, if only he got up earlier, if only he'd sent off more applications, he would have been okay. Now there are a few things that these stories have in common. The first is the ideological claim in each case is made by a worker, obviously. I've chosen examples like this for a reason. It may be that the ideas originate from elsewhere. I mean, you know, the idea that we don't all think up our ideas all by ourselves is not unique or original. But somehow these claims resonated enough with their own general perspective and life experiences that they could articulate them as if they'd thought them all up by themselves. Second, in each case there's a moral claim involved, and this is very important. There's an adjudication of right and wrong, there's blame and resentment, and it revolves around the allocation and distribution of resources. Is this in the context of a global economic crisis precipitated by the activities of the rich, usually the obscenely rich, harming workers overwhelmingly? Third, each of these claims, I would argue, is empirically falsifiable. You could document the falsehood in each case, and yet I think pointing this out would probably make no sustained difference to the perspective of each of the persons holding such views. And why is this important? I think it's important because ideology, one, has a material existence as a set of material practices condensed in institutions through which people live and reproduce themselves. We talk about families, we talk about schools, the media, trade unions, political parties, and so on. It is formative of the political terrain. It situates the actors. It prepares people for the choices they make. It partially determines the outcome of significant class struggles. This means that it's not good enough to say that the lower level of struggle creates a space for reactionary ideologies to take hold, when the availability of actors for particular types of struggle, for particular strategies, has a lot to do with their already formed ideological predispositions. The implication that the real contradiction between labour and capital will finally assert itself and dispel such ideological vapours, that has been skewered by Stuart Hall more than 40 years ago, almost 35 years ago, and nothing that has happened since then suggests that the satire was anything but on the money. And here it's not a question of replacing economic reductionism with ideological reductionism, but of finding the right articulation between these different determinations. Thirdly, this is the most difficult suggestion that I would make, but it's one I want to stress. Ideology is at some level correct. Now, I immediately sort of feel a desire to pull back from this because actually there's nothing correct about some ideologies, racism, sexism, homophobia, blaming workers for being unemployed. The point I'm making, though, is not that every specific ideological iteration contains a necessary grain of truth, a rational kernel, or whatever, but rather that it can't be reduced to false consciousness, that it in some sense operates on, gives expression to, and is articulated with real lived experience. And it's important to bear this in mind, particularly when you're faced with news articles or polls which purport to demonstrate the general stupidity and ignorance of the public. Quite often you get this sort of thing in the United Kingdom. There was a poll taken of the British public on the questions pertaining to austerity and the government's austerity agenda, and found that, predictably, most people based their conclusions about austerity, benefit cuts and so on totally false and misleading information. Okay? The people's willingness to believe false and misleading information is actually what's important here. Okay? Before going any further with this, I want to qualify what I'm saying. I mean, many reactionary agendas succeed without being in any way popular. In a class democracy, winning a majority is not usually necessary, particularly if an agenda is supported by powerful class fractions. Well, if you think of Mrs. Thatcher, she didn't have to have majority support. It was enough to have big business, at least, generally speaking, on side, the dogged support of the petty bourgeoisie, and the provisional support of some skilled workers. That was her class basis. It wasn't a majority, and it didn't have to be. It's different for leftists, of course, because the force of numbers is often the only advantage that we have. We certainly don't have the advantage of controlling state apparatuses, generally speaking. So when I talk about ideological battles, it's important to recognise that they are fought in a highly uneven terrain. Further, ideology is often reduced to opinion, and it's crucial to bear in mind that there is no such thing as a stable, coherent entity like public opinion. That is an artifact of the desire of pollsters to provide a simple data from which marketing strategies, whether of political parties or of firms, can be devised. I mean, In this sense, opinion should be treated more as a sort of field of forces and antagonisms in which agents can hold ambiguous or even downright contradictory views. This is what perhaps is being registered when we notice that a slight change in the wording of an opinion poll yields drastically different results. The existence of such ambiguities is what allows for ideological contestation to take place. It provides the point of interventions, and it's why whenever there is an issue, whatever the issue is, it can always be put another way. And this is what we're dealing with in the context of austerity. Somehow, in the UK at least, I'm sure it's not that different here, the right has successfully, by and large successfully, converted a crisis of capitalism into a crisis of overspending, a crisis of overpaid union workers, a crisis of the feckless poor with their lax moral standards, and unreliable borrowing habits, creating economic chaos. And this has not been a total success. Ideological successes are never total. Ideology is characterized by far more by disorder than coherence. But in the broad balance of views, the right has been winning. And of course, it's not just the right that's been arguing for austerity, but the right leads these arguments. And that has happened in the context, to reiterate, of a general crisis of capitalism, which means, when I say general crisis, an ideological and political crisis as much as an economic one. Think of the level of declining trust in parliamentary institutions, governing institutions, the collapse of faith in newspapers, particularly in the UK where we've had the Murdoch crisis, the emergence of alternative sources of information on the internet. The fact that these traditional modes of political domination are a crisis, yet nonetheless the right has been able to come back and take the political initiative is a signal political achievement. Now, the evidence of this is that it builds upon, in these successes, the past achievements of neoliberalism, not just in defeating the class forces that could have resisted it, but also in terms of reconfiguring the apparatuses of the state and those within the strategic field of the state. Think of the way in which the civil service bureaucracy was reorganized under the banner of public choice economics, the spread of neoliberalism in the technical disciplines of government and business management, the transformation of social democracy in response to neoliberal offensives, the successful ideological battle within media institutions. In the United Kingdom, one of the fronts of ideological contestation in the 1980s was actually with the BBC, which was a sort of big establishment holdout against outright Thatcherism. That changed completely, of course. Changing the fabric of everyday experience, of course, was just as important. The logic of the market and competition is more and more taken for granted as the basis for provision and action, because that is the reality of what structures people's everyday experience. It's not just that services have been privatized, that welfare has been scaled back and restructured, that unions have been seen off in most private sector industries, but also that what is left of welfare and public service is more and more subject to the logic of competition, and it's a competition in which neoliberal sort of culture constantly tells us the least deserving always win. You know, it's always the scroungers, it's always the fraudsters. They're the ones who are winning this fight, this struggle for scarce resources. At any rate, it is in the spaces vacated by social democracy, or where social democracy was always problematic, or inefficient, or oppressive. These are where neoliberalism has been able to take hold and grow and expand. And this, I will suggest, is a long-term effect. Political struggles are rapid. They're often settled very quickly. Ideological struggles are glacially slow. They're fruit born in the maturation of generations. Because neoliberalism didn't win every ideological fight immediately under Thatcher and Reagan and so on. Indeed, many of those battles were lost at the level of popular ideology. They may have won within the elite institutions, but the popular ideology they lost in the short term. But that doesn't mean that in fighting these ideological battles, they did not prepare the ground for future successes, which came to fruition, actually, I think, contemporaneously under New Labour and under the New Democrats. Just because neoliberalism makes advances, of course, doesn't mean it ever secures a totally closed ideological terrain. The terrain is necessarily not closed and not finished. It's always articulated with other dimensions of social reality, above all economic and political power. It is always changing shape. The coordinates change such that what appears to be a success now can be rendered irrelevant quite soon. Moreover, there are always antagonisms and struggles that can't simply be incorporated into a dominant neoliberal common sense. And after all, even if the government has usually got its way on austerity, certainly in the UK this has been true, this has hardly been frictionless. We've seen the student movement, trade union strikes, lots of fairly vibrant local campaigns such as the provisionally successful hospital campaigns to prevent them from being closed. The problem as I see it here is that to the extent that there have been antagonisms and struggles to resist austerity, mostly unsuccessful, the extent to which the ideological terrain has been purged of systemic alternatives and the collapse of confidence in all practical leftist answers, however statist or parliamentarist they've been, means that these struggles are all too often easily encircled, okay, and explained away by various experience, you know. Rather than pointing to a wider challenge to capitalism and its dominant ideologies, rather than being linked to what you might call a socialist common sense, they can at best exploit ambiguities in dominant sort of normativities, whether it's neoliberal or whether it's activating residual social democratic consciousness. And at worst, these struggles can appear as actually ruinous, deviant, criminal. I'm thinking here of the riots in the UK that took place around 2011. So, taking ideology seriously, I think, means that it's not the question of trying to reduce every aspect of ruling class success to ideology, but rather taking it as one of the determinations that shapes our future chances. And I want to finish on an example which illustrates, I think, some of how this works and gives us a clue as to how we can intervene effectively. And this is the example of Shaneen Thorpe. I don't know if you know of this case. I mean, it's very UK-centric. I apologise, quite parochial perhaps, but it might illuminate some of the dimensions of the ideological struggle here as well. Shaneen Thorpe was and is a single mother who worked full-time for Tower Hamlets Council, which is a poor council in the East End of London. And she claimed housing benefit, like many, many working people do in the UK, because, well, you know how it works. The housing market has been allowed to, you know, go mad because this is how the economy is made to boom in the UK. Housing is deliberately rationed in order to push up prices, get real estate speculation going, and so on. So those who need to sustain themselves in housing quite often have to get to cover the cost of rent or mortgage. So what happens here is that she was interviewed by the BBC because the government was introducing a new policy which is called the bedroom tax. And the bedroom tax was basically cuts to your benefits if you claimed housing benefits if you had what they deemed a spare bedroom. Now that doesn't necessarily mean to say that you had a spare bedroom. You might have a dining room which they decided to classify as a spare bedroom. But the point is simply this. This woman had been told that she was going to be charged the bedroom tax because she had a spare room that she wasn't using. And she was interviewed about the BBC for this, and the BBC's interview consisted of questioning along the following lines. First and foremost, why do you choose to live on your own? Why don't you live with your mother? Who says you're allowed to have a house of your own just because you're a single working mother? Why should you? If it's the taxpayer that has to pay for it, why should you be allowed to claim that? Now, it's interesting this because actually there's an ideology in the UK which is quite popular, the supermum. And the supermum is a sort of businesswoman who has kids, you know, and is juggling various careers and commitments and charity work and a vibrant social life and so on and so forth, and somehow manages to keep it all together. But in this ideology, Shaneen Thorpe didn't qualify as a supermum, despite all her various responsibilities and despite all meeting these challenges, because of her class location. Because, you know, her particular way of, you know, her particular gendered experience wasn't at the right social level. So, yeah, the ideology that was deployed here was, I mean, this was part of a general government offensive which was to say, and this is in the words of David Cameron, that the family is the best welfare state that we have. Therefore, we really should stop people depending upon taxpayers and the government, and people should start living closer together with, maybe with their extended multi-generational families in cramped housing conditions. And what this did was, of course, to render the fact that render invisible what was actually taking place here was that a large part of what Janine Thorpe was doing was reproducing the next generation of workers. It was reproducing the general sort of conditions of effectivity of society, and that the housing benefit that she was being paid was part of a social wage. And this is, the ideology that was deployed against it was, of course, it was profoundly sexist. It was actually, implicitly, there was an element of racism to it because she was of mixed race. But above all, it was using a class argument to render invisible, an important aspect of social reality. So, the stigma that was then attached to her and to people who claimed these housing benefits, and that was used to demonize them as scroungers and so on and so forth, depended upon, previously it would have depended upon your status as somebody who was not in full employment. If you claim welfare, then you must not be fully employed. She was in full employment. It's the mere fact that she claimed any entitlement to welfare that was the problem. So the dominant ideology here was shifting. The terms of the dominant ideology were shifting as part of a general offensive against the social wage and against the welfare state and against the public sector. Now, I want to qualify this. The bedroom tax is actually one of the less popular aspects of the government's agenda, but I'm just demonstrating how, in specific contexts, you have an articulation between different ideological apparatuses, the House of Commons, the dominant political parties, the think tanks that have developed these ideologies, the BBC itself, which prepared and produced this interview, and all of this producing a set of ideological meanings through which people are given to interpret this experience. And if we want to intervene in this, I think we have to think about this on two levels. First of all, this campaign would have made no sense and would not have been effective to the extent that it was, and none of the arguments around austerity would make sense or be effective to the extent that they are, unless they were able to build upon established ideological preconceptions, established elements of neoliberal common sense. And so it's not just a question of responding to short-term issues that arise and building alliances around short-term goals. Rather, it's the fact that we have to start thinking in the same way that the ruling class does. The ruling class thinks long-term. They have been working for decades, for over a generation, on building up. And it's not just simply a ruling class conspiracy, but generally speaking, it's a class ideology. That this has been working over the long term, and we will need a similar attitude. If political struggles are short term, if ideological struggles are glacially long term, then we need to have a similar attitude. We need a generational process that will require the development of a multitude of apparatuses, possibly parties, possibly fronts, possibly publications, and so on, that will enable us to develop what you might characterize as a socialist common sense, in which, when struggles take place, and we don't have any control over when and how they will, when antagonisms emerge, they will fairly rapidly and immediately be rendered intelligible in light of a general critique of and offensive against capitalism. I'll leave it there. Thank you.